Hello and welcome to the Conscious Design Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Peterman, and I turn product ideas into sustainable seven-figure businesses. Join me for another episode where sustainability meets innovation and business savvy. Today, I'm excited to have Kevin Kennon. He's the founder of Kennon Design Consultancy, where he's bringing all of his experience to designing resiliency and eco-friendliness into architecture. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, as we were just chatting off recording, when you probably didn't wake up, get born doing this. So I'd love to kind of step back and how did you go from getting into architecture and then going, hey, well, how do I approach this from a sustainability and resiliency standpoint?
Okay, well, thanks. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, Ian, and I like your show and listen to it, and I encourage people to do this because you're kind of doing it the best way, which is as if you and I had just met, which is actually the case. But we met in a forum where we could sort of talk just one-on-one. And then it's always great to get feedback from people who listen to this, and because it sparks more conversation. And I think that's the really beauty of this particular medium and its power. Right? It's basically that you could actually have that kind of reach. Anyway, so I grew up, and we moved around a lot when I was very little, including a stint in South America for 2 years, 𝗡ście𝘁𝗯𝗹𝗲. That was a very important experience for me and foundational. Then essentially moved to California, where I lived in a place in the area. It was called 𝗡ście𝘁𝗯𝗃, and I lived in a place, a very idyllic place called 𝗡ście𝘁𝗁𝗃. And it's up in the hills. It's an area. What's interesting about this place where I lived is that there had been some work done really in the 1920s, and it created a sort of landslide. And then half of this development was sliding in the ocean, and the other half was left exactly as it was. They put a moratorium on building it. So when we actually got there, our house was beautiful house. I mean, unbelievably beautiful house. Kind of very Japanese. And what was interesting is that it was done by a Japanese gardener's family. And they built these amazing gardens all around the house. But the area, it was like frozen in time. So it basically stopped development in the 1930s. And so all of the houses and everything in it were from that era. And it was very rural. It was kind of wild, but it was a great place to live. Unfortunately, recently, because of the heavy rains, this is prior, obviously, to the fires. Because of the heavy rains, there's so much water came in that it caused the area where I live now to start to slide. But it was sliding at a rate of 6 inches per month. I mean, it's an incredible thing. They declared it a disaster area. And I think they've managed to sort of control the speed, at least, of the kind of slide. Everybody has, theoretically, they've told everybody to evacuate, but there's still people there who are living in their house. Some of them houses are completely twisted and turned. There's a great sort of video in the LA Times of this guy who just wanted to stick it out in this wild area just because it's so beautiful. And he liked the fact that it was the very thing that was causing the neighborhood to really start to deteriorate was actually the thing that was keeping it pristine from being developed. So I don't know what the story to that, the moral of that is, but for me, what's interesting is that I'm somebody whose childhood home is literally slipping away into the ocean, and it's a long time since I've lived there, and we moved away, but nonetheless, it's something that's indelible to all of us, right? If you think about the place we really grew up. And so, of course, I spent years of my life, where we would help fight fires, creating fire breaks, living that life, I completely understand. And I can't begin to tell you how horrific it is to feel like your house is about to just go up in cinders any second. There's nothing, it's so sudden and it's so horrible. I think it's almost one of the worst things that someone can suffer through.
Yeah, hard thing to go through for sure.
I have a lot of empathy for people out there right now. I think it's going to take a long time to sort through that. Just the legal issues alone, I think, are going to be horrendous.
Yeah, that stuff always takes forever. As soon as you get that involved.
Right.
You grew up there, right?
Yeah.
And when did you get into architecture? When was that like your hit?
To full disclosure, my father was an architect, so I was always around architecture, and he was quite a successful architect too. The story about my father was he had grown up in Louisiana, and he was a football player, and was a high school All-American, and then he got a scholarship to go play football at Texas A&M. This was in the 50s, early 50s. And the coach at A&M was Bear Bryant, who's a famous football coach. Anyway, he was very good at that, but he took some architecture at A&M and sort of liked it. Then he was actually drafted by the Chicago Bears, and he decided instead that he wanted to go to Michigan and study architecture with Eero Saarinen. We didn't work with Eero Saarinen. And so, I kind of grew up in that. And my father went on to become the dean at Rice University and the president of then the sort of largest architecture company in the world. So that was obviously a thing, but I wasn't necessarily going to do that. I was an English major in college. But the thing that really kind of, made the difference for me is you could, through my college, go to New York and study for a year, architecture for a year, at this kind of crazy program called the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies. And I did that. I was at the right place at the right time in the city, because that was really the center for a lot of, I would say, intellectual activity and, a lot of work on theory, because at the time it was a major recession, inflationary recession. It was really, really bad. So there was no work. And so that's what people did.
I like that idea of being able to go and study something for a year and really go try something outside your major like that.
Well, and this was in the late 70s. And so, New York was a very different place. The city was. And we lived right on the edge of Times Square. So it was a sort of dumb thing and great thing to do at the same time. But in my experience, those two words are not mutually exclusive.
Yes, that is very true.
Yeah, because it's that sort of just leap of faith, and we'll just go with this. And it turned out to be great. It was a terrific thing. And I fell in love with architecture through that, because I had very great teachers, and I think that helps a lot.
Yeah, having people that can really guide you, especially as you're getting into something, is invaluable, I think.
Yeah.
Helps you figure things out faster.
It is, and I don't know. I have 2 kids of my own, so I've taught, at Yale and Princeton and Columbia and Cooper-E, and I've taught these architecture in these different places and given lectures and podcasts, and it's a great way to actually communicate what it is you're trying to do, because I think the profession is about to undergo through some significant changes, and I hope so. And I think that for me, the conversation needs to be more and more about how do we do things better, and how to take people from different perspectives across the AEC industry and, listen to people from all the way up, because I don't think we really have the right ecosystem yet to build things in a way that's in the best interest of everyone involved. So not just the interest of a few people who want to get something accomplished and will stop at nothing to do that. But to me, the success of a project is when everybody takes ownership of it. Yeah.
You need that.
Right.
Well, I'm curious, because I have a buddy who's an architect, and he's very much into his, I guess, kind of the way he's described it to me from the architecture. I'm industrial design, so I'm good with the product, but
I like that.
He's the architect side, and he's like, well, if you think about it, how have we built houses in the same exact way for the last 100 years?
Right.
Everybody else, industrial design, like we're using all kinds of new materials and, right, really exploring and driving consumer products, right? And he's like, right. His thing is, well, why are we stuck? Why aren't we building better stuff? Why aren't we looking at different materials? There's, things have changed a lot in the last century. How can we use that to what you're saying, right? How do you build something that's more efficient? How do you build something that's more sustainable, easier, better for everyone involved? Really thinking through what that process is.
You start with lean construction. I mean, that to me is the thing that it's so amazing to me is that how much our industry is still dependent upon a completely antiquated way of design, bid, build, just as the sort of classic example. I think it's at least a 19th century construct, legally, as far as I know. And taking that structure, which, let's face it, if everybody plays by the rules up front, theoretically it should work and you should get the best ideal. And I think, back in the time when you would submit a drawing set of maybe 4 images or five sets of drawings for a house, and that'd be enough. Today it would be 35, 40, maybe 50 even, depending on how many different disciplines are involved in it. So each one having their own set, and so it gets bigger and bigger, and the more complex our buildings, the more it gets to thousands of pages just for the drawing set. And I think the issue has become so regulated by liability that the sort of, it had gotten to the point when I first started working, especially on sort of complex building projects, the first thing I learned was that, and I unfortunately had a real, like, old guard construction superintendent who taught me this lesson. But basically, the name of the game was that his job was to make me look bad, right? You were trying to find as much fault in the drawings so that you could basically claim a change order, and especially if the whole purpose of the bid was just to pick the lowest bidder, everybody sort of races to the bottom, skims over their estimates artificially, says, oh, we're going to do it this way this time, or, whatever, and does whatever it gets to get the low bid. And some people will sort of knowingly undercut it, to do that, figuring, oh, well, this is going to be a complicated job. There's going to be 200, 300, 1,000 change orders on it, whatever. And, we're going to get 15% of all that no matter what. That's how people would sort of kind of construct this to make their money. And so the incentive wasn't to collaborate, just the opposite. It was basically to make it adversarial. And so that's what OAC meetings, owner architect construction meetings, were like, when I first started working in New York doing skyscrapers. And then people just screaming at each other. And so that, fortunately, I think is, people are trying to get beyond that, but even still, it really does constrain, how much people are willing to do. It's a little bit like the same problem on a construction site, which is so, especially if it's a union job, which is so constrained by what the union is telling its members it can and cannot do on a job site. So we have these constraints to efficiency that I think are the things that you have to start to tackle first. And obviously, if you created a more collaborative environment, theoretically, that's what BIM is supposed to do. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way because BIM is still a pretty complicated ecosystem to get into. And increasingly, what's happening is just firms are hiring BIM specialists to do this. They're and it's getting farther away from what the architects and the design team's responsibility, which is the owner's design intent. That's really the purpose of it. I think that until we can create a way, and by the way, I don't think design build is all that great either, because unfortunately the way that design build has come to be, this is completely, what I'm about to say is a completely made up figure. I don't really know exactly, but this is just an educated guess on my part. But I would suspect that the most of the design build companies are driven by the general contractor, where the architect is contracted to the GC and essentially works for the GC. And the problem with that, and this is why there's some advantages to the old, the traditional system, where there's a kind of arm's length relationship between the architect and the general contractor, because they're supposed to sort of keep each other in check. It's a little bit of like a check and balance. Architects, by certifying the payments, making sure the work is done, materials on the site, et cetera. That's one way that's a check for the owner to making sure that they're getting what they're paid for. And for the contractor, if there's a way that he can do something and achieve the same design intent, but do it more efficiently or cheaper for himself, he puts that up for review, and a lot of times that's the way it goes. And I think that's what you want. You want that sort of more of that, and more of it from the beginning. That's the other problem. Unfortunately, the old system does it. It tends to break things up into smaller pieces. And what you really want, and the best projects I've worked on, is where the owner understands that they're looking at not just building a project, but they're building a community of including thousands of people, especially if it's a large, say, skyscraper in New York City, that they want, just to reiterate this, what they really want is people to have ownership of that process. So.
Right. And you've worked on quite a few projects, big and small. So, and you kind of answered it, but what I was going to ask is, when you're looking at all these factors, how is sustainability goals and LEED certification, how is that, do you feel like that's part of the change in how things, the kind of the older system to now, is that impacting it? And I guess a follow-up to that would be kind of how could we go about making this more efficient, where we can? What's the blend in your mind of old system, new system, to make it actually good for everyone?
Well, I'm a big believer in technology. So I wish that our industry wasn't dominated as much as it is by just a few players. It really, I think, hurts innovation. It has to. I think Autodesk is way too monopolistic. So, apart from that, it's not to say that they don't innovate. It's just that I think that if you had, unfortunately, there are other players, and increasingly so, and I think that's going to change a lot. I think ultimately, frankly, AI is going to change everything. I'm not saying that like I'm somebody who has sort of been at the forefront of using technology and certainly in architecture all my career. And I do use AI, and I understand it, and I understand what its use is. And I think that architecture is going to be something that AI is going to do very well. Because already we're seeing generative AI programs and platforms like TestFit, for example, where you can take a particular lot, and it has the zoning information essentially built in, and you can quickly go through, here's my parking count, how I want to lay that out. Once you have your parking count, you can figure out where you're going to put your tower, your residential tower, because it usually is driven by the parking anyway. And then it's like, well, I want this mix, I want that mix, and you can do that all essentially a matter of an hour, maybe less, if you know what you're doing. And then you can essentially create your whatever parameters you want and just go. So I think what we're going to get to is that we'll be able to do that with relatively quickly. It'll be able to sort of take those generative drawings, take it to the next scale, either put it into Revit, if that's the sort of ecosystem everybody's working in, or some other, where at least it can start to become a real digital twin of the building, because that's the whole point, is that we have to get to something, I don't think BIM does that, but
I was at industrial design conference. They were actually talking about, they were doing some work with using VR and things like that, because they were working with, I forget which college, I think it was in the Midwest somewhere, but they basically were like, hey, we want to redesign this intersection, because there's a lot of small accidents, heavy foot traffic right next to the college campus. So it kind of hadn't changed for 40 years. And so they used that, and they they were talking about, the digital twin and using VR and that kind of technology to let people experience the change, walk through an intersection, without the risk of cars and shutting it down for a day for someone to walk through, right? And it was interesting, and you mentioned the digital twin. It's happening. I feel like there's a lot of steps between where we are now and an actual digital twin. And there's companies, and I'd love your thoughts on this. There's companies that are working on like smart city and trying to really like fully upgrade our city infrastructure. And I feel like that's a great, that's something I want to work on more, is to how to do that. But I feel like there's a lot of steps still between being able to redo the entire infrastructure of a city and really bring it to this century and where we are now with what we are attempting as digital twins.
Well, I started another company. It's a development company that specializes in ultra luxury wilderness hotels. And it's built around a completely different model than people are used to seeing when they think of, let's say, eco hotels, and actually harkens back to something even older. And it's a different service model. And what's interesting about it, it's also a laboratory for technology. So it's kind of a both. It's sort of a think tank / resort. And,
okay,
but in really cool sort of extreme locations. So, and anyway, so the point of that is that the methodology of how you put these things together is something that I think about a lot, not just in terms of logistics, because that's all sort of solvable, but really more in terms of organizing people. Having been through many of these, I know who has to sit around the table, who needs to be there at different times of this in order to ensure success. And sometimes it can be a little bit of a slog, but you're talking about huge investments of money, and people want as fast a return as possible. It's still real estate and still real estate development. But, everything, in my experience, is that everything is how you start. If you don't have the right people there at the beginning, or at least even if it's just a few hours of their time, and they're while some of this is being conceived. So you're not only designing, a building, but you're designing the way in which you're going to design that building and the way in which you're going to build that building. And those all come together. Hopefully, you're not facing change orders. You've figured it all out from the beginning. That's the idea. And that's the best way to build. And it turns out to be the safest way to build too. So stuff is going to happen, and you need to have both a way in which you handle problems and how you track those problems, and particularly, focus on the critical path. What are our obstacles here? Why is this an obstacle? Can this be, essentially, that's all important. And what you want to do is be able to create that into one whole system where you can monitor all of this, and it's data, obviously, but it's also the effectiveness of your team. Anyways, this is what I do right now, and this is what I think about it. And I've done a few projects where I've just been essentially brought in as an advisor to a client to help them through some challenges on the job site. So that's something I actually do very well, because a lot of times that the communication is broken down, everything is broken down, all of the workflows that are important to keep a project going, because it only ends up, unfortunately, the way in which real estate and building and architecture all work is that it's cheaper up front, and then the more you get into the project, it gets more and more expensive. So people really feel the weight of it at the end. But you want that to be tempered with satisfaction that the process wasn't as bad as they thought it could have been, and there was transparency involved, and that the thing was managed well, and you kept your eye on the ball. Your eye on the ball for doing anything involving this much effort is schedule. The schedule is everything. It's like you win or lose on this with the schedule. The slightest hint that it's going off schedule, you should jump all over it and get your team around it, because it's usually a death by 1,000 cuts. It's a little bit here and it's a little bit here, and
hey, you lose a day a week, it adds up.
Yeah, it adds up. You get a $5,000 change order here, and then maybe it's 17, and then it's I mean, that's obviously a kind of silly way of doing it, but for a lot of people that's relatable. I still complain or monitor, even though I don't do as much driving living in New York, but I still drive, and I guess I habitually always look at the price of gasoline.
Just looking at that yesterday.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, this is up.
Yeah, exactly. It just is a dumb, barometer. Oh yeah, so the price of gas is up. And that tends to be like checking the temperature outside, right? And that's a common way in which we all sort of gauge the health of our respective economies. Anyway, so the point of all this is just that I think there's an opportunity now, and with AI, that we're going to be able to completely change the way in which we work. I used to be a huge believer that everybody needs to be in the studio all the time. I need to be able to watch everybody. But the reality is, I found I got the best work out of people, or I get the best work out of people when I give them, meet with them just for a few minutes, talk about what they're doing, and then just let them go and do it. And then, either at the end of the day or the next morning or whatever, see the results and go through the results with them and then make changes and, what have you. But it wasn't always this way. I started out when we first started working more with computers, and we were drawing less. And especially if it was three-dimensional, you had to be kind of either sitting down on the person's desk and essentially manipulating the program yourself, or you had to sort of be next to them. While they did that, I quickly learned that people didn't like, having somebody next to them while observing what they're doing. That made them feel very uncomfortable, rightfully so. And, me sitting down and going through the material was sometimes better, but at the same time, it was harder to communicate. So anyway, so the point in all this is that you use lots of different ways to do that, lots of different methods, different programs, different prints, to just pure digital markups, to what have you, to sketches. But we can do all of that exactly the way you and I are working right now. We can put up drawings, we can do that, we can mark them up, we can print them out at home, I can scan them and send them back, and put notes in there. It's really, we're at the point where we can create, and this is something which I'm really very interested in doing, is that the same model that real estate developers here in New York, for example, when they do a building, they'll create their own LLC around the building that they're doing. So, if it's, 20 Spring Street or something, and 20 Spring Street they're going to tear down what's there, and they're going to build a new 60-unit tower or something, and they'll form a 20 Spring Street LLC that's just there to build that building. And once they build it and they sell it, they turn it over to the condo board, and they're out of there. That's the sort of developer model, the kind of 5-year horizon, start to finish, with that sort of exit. So the point I'm making is that it seems like I'm very interested in exploring project-based companies, where you basically form projects around each company, and it's its own structure, and people that are essentially all shareholders in that company, so that you get buy-in. When I talk about just the guy who's driving nails too.
Hey, it's Ian here. So glad you're enjoying this episode of Conscious Design. If you want the full scoop on conscious design, what it is, how we do it, how you can do it, then check out our book. We wrote it so creative entrepreneurs like you can code social and environmental responsibility right into your brand's DNA. You can download the first chapter for free. Link is in the description. Enjoy the rest of the episode. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.
We don't really do that on the products side.
No.
But I think it's an interesting way to go about, because it is, like you were saying before, it can be hard actually to get enough buy-in from people. If you don't own it, right, how much do you really care?
Well, that's also very interesting. The thing I found is, like, I designed and developed a building here in 𝗏𝗏. It's a little bit like this. It was the original American Express building in New York City. American Express was founded in Hartford. And American Express was like the Pony Express. It basically was people riding around horses, delivering things. And so this building is in 𝗏𝗏. And it was like a lot of buildings in 𝗏𝗏 originally, manufacturing buildings. And so this building was the old manufacturing building, zone manufacturing. It had gone through different incarnations, but it had become the artist Alexander Calder, the guy who did all the sculptures and the mobiles, and it was his studio. So that's where he, one of the places he created all these crazy art. He's a great, mid-century modern artist, and also beloved by architects. His work is always in all of those buildings. And then it became a nightclub called Area, which is kind of very hip nightclub for about 6 years. And then it was in complete, disuse. And we sort of put a syndicate together and designed it so that all of the people in the syndicate had their area more or less corresponded to the amount of money they put into the project. And then it was subdivided, and each unit was completely different. They didn't stack. And it was this great old building, but if you saw the original image of it, was completely covered in graffiti. It was whitewashed over. It was a complete dispersed bare. And so anyway, we brought the building back to life. Then we added 3 stories of glass apartments to the top, and especially the penthouse apartment, which is kind of like a little glass house with 5,000 square feet of deck all the way around it. It's a pretty amazing place. But that's the thing is, and that was all company that we created to do that project. And in a way, it's a little bit of a model of an idea for this. But so that's kind of what I've been trying to see is that doing these kind of projects, we not only look at doing them more sustainably, et cetera, but also how do we do them in a way where we're really tackling the ecosystem itself, and changing the way in which we build. It's a different model, I think, and we'll see.
I think it's a great thing that we're talking about this, right? Sustainability is important. And if you want to be able to do that more and you want to have successful projects and you want to open up possibly how you do this, you have to think about, right, the approach. How do you go about that? How do you accomplish this in a way that gets everybody on board and make sure that everybody supports it, not just at the beginning when everybody feels good, but all the way through end, actually finishing it. Because there's, I feel like the product side especially, I think the number is like 93% or something like that. Projects fail. They just don't ever make it. And it's wasted effort, wasted time,
right?
Lost resources.
But that it's never a wasted effort. Everything,
you can get something out of it.
To me, I admire cultures that embrace failure as part of their process. I mean, as a scientist, probably at a much higher percentage, I would say probably closer to 98%. But that doesn't stop them from doing what they're doing or trying, because each step they understand, is that, okay, we sort of fail. What did we learn? Okay. And adjust. So I say that's one thing. Now, the other part of this is that I can only rely on my own experience to know that what I'm talking about is fundamental. There is better ways to do it. And when I have practiced it in better ways, the results have been phenomenal. So obviously you have to get some kind of buy-in. And I think that's good. And I think the point here is, let's put it this way. You wouldn't go out today and say a product, right? You wouldn't go out and say, hey, I think that what people are going to need in the, next, whatever, 2 years is a way to detach themselves from their cell phone, right? I don't know what that is, but there's a product, let's say, that does that. And you can say, I've designed this amazing product. You're not really going to go out and test it on people. And the way in which you do that is your product is actually an unpleasant experience for most people. There's like the 35% of the people become violently ill or something as a result of whatever this product. I'm just being extreme. I don't know what the product is. But the point is, it's not to know because it's not relevant to the point that I'm making. The issue is the efficacy of what it is you do has to be driven by what people need. You know, if people don't need it, or at least feel they need it, or even if it's just the most ephemeral, feel I'm going to miss out if I don't get it, or put it on the positive side, or, you know, just this thing is so amazing and it's going to make me feel even better. Those are all kind of strong drivers that have to do a sort of more visceral sustainability, which is just survival, because they come from that same place. And I think that architecture also comes from that same place too. I do think it's people experiencing it viscerally. I don't know if you saw The Brutalist yet, if you've seen the film, but I think that's one of the reasons people like the movie, is that it's the images of architecture are so kind of, they harken back to a kind of almost a sort of 30s, almost Depression era type of sublime grandeur and simplicity, but very emotional. Combining film and architecture in that way, I think, is very profound.
And this has come up in some conversations with other people, is, you know, the average person doesn't necessarily walk into a building or, you know, even their home and think about, like, what's the emotional reaction? What's the emotional state? What's the change when you walk through a doorway? And it's funny, I was just reading some studies on it, and I forget the exact term on it, but there's a term for it, is when you walk through a doorway, your nervous system changes depending on, you know, because you're changing environment. Your mind, even though you're not like, oh, I'm walking through a doorway, consciously thinking about it, your mind is going, oh, we just changed into a new space, because you are, right? You can make one room next to another and the doorway between, and they can be two totally different experiences emotionally, right? It's two different states of mind that you can be in. And it's something that, you know, I don't know how much, I don't think we think about that as much necessarily as, you know, relative to how much it impacts us, right? I think it's a huge impact, and if we were to apply a little more kind of thinking through that could really make an impact into how do you experience a building.
You know, think of, you know, you look at all the stuff that exploded, really started in the pandemic and then sort of became a big deal. Is this sort of all these sort of immersive environments that people have created, and by immersive I mean specifically digital environments, but that surround you, right? You know, so it's a kind of more of a sensory experience, and I think that for a lot of people is a sort of heightened version of what you're talking about. You know, but there's also something about going into spaces that are just so serene, so quiet, so empty in some way, that actually also profound. And I don't mean just, you know, spiritual places, but there are places that could be from anywhere. And it's so much of, even your memories are probably framed by architecture. They're not just, when we remember people, I think we usually remember them in some sort of context as well. And so I think even if the context is no longer there, or it's a, you know, lost place in time, still, I don't believe when I, you know, have dreams, or even when I have sort of memories of past events, I don't put people in sort of a void in that, at least in my mind. You know, they're always in some sort of a place. So I think that's the thing, is that I don't think they realize how much of architecture influences their unconscious and subconscious. And it goes to the same sort of very sort of liminal places, which is obviously there's, you know what it's like to walk through your home, your threshold, and the feelings involved in that. It's not just purely sentimental, but it's a feeling of safety and belonging and, all kinds of things. And maybe sometimes it's a conflicted feeling. It's not so great. But the house itself tends to carry it's a repository of memory. For me, when you start to think about memory as being fundamental to culture, and I can't really think of architecture as being meaningful without it being fundamentally a cultural artifact. It's a product of culture.
Yeah, I don't think you can pull those two apart.
Yeah, and so it's not just building. I mean, we've had building for a long time, but I think to me, one of my other endeavors, I actually inherited that same program, the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, and I've been the director of that for about 26 years. And it's changed over time. We basically, when I took it over, we were just doing the education department. There was other things that the Institute did, and it was quite famous for, especially publications and other events. But we just wanted to focus on education, and we did. It's a great program. We graduated a lot of people, and coincidentally, just in terms of the Brutalist, one of our graduates, Griffin Frazen, was the architecture advisor on the Brutalist. So, and you can see in it a lot of his work. He's a very talented young up-and-coming designer. So I'm putting a plug in for Griffin. But I like that, and I like helping younger firms. And because I've also worked with many people in real life, and so part of what I'd love to do is bring together the right people and let them do their thing. It's more like you're bringing together all the best musicians to create this symphony. The symphony itself is, built around your project, and it's designed to get the very best music from it. I do think, someone said it at some point, architecture is frozen music, and I think that's really true. I think it has the same capabilities of invoking a lot of the feelings that you can get from music. It has that sort of connection to memory, So if you hear a tune of something, you'll remember sometimes, like, oh yeah, I was with so-and-so, and that was a great moment. And I do think the same thing happens. So anyway.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Music and architecture, you can create. And I think that, I guess, deep down, everybody that does designers, for the most part, architects, product, we talk about it. It's in there, like, oh, think about the emotions of the user and things like that. And it's there, but we don't always sit and have a deeper conversation like we're just having now, of going, okay, well, yeah, I'm glad you're aware of it now, but how do we then cultivate that? How do you?
Yeah, you're working under a deadline. You got, you have to get, like, I don't know, however many variations on an idea that you might have to produce, and to help the client through the selection process, and or at least try to hone exactly what they're looking for. And sometimes that can be a tedious process, and sometimes it can be a lot of fun. It does, in my experience, depend a lot on the people involved in it. The whole process just makes them incredibly nervous, because I'm plunking down all this money and I got nothing, and it takes a long time. Did I make the right bet, or was this a mistake? Right. And so you get a lot of second guessing. Sometimes it's a lot of tension around that. This is particularly true, say, private clients. But regardless, the whole point of it is that if you can engender trust and collaboration and figure out a way, to wrap a project up from a liability perspective to really limit everyone's liability on the project. And so, I don't know, my sense of it is you would get a better project at the end. It might cost a little more upfront, but you're buying that extra cost. To me, is insurance. The other thing I do, I'm an expert witness cases and stuff. And so I see it from the other side, and I just think that when the adversarial system goes haywire and everybody ends up suing everybody at the end of the project or even the middle of the project, I've seen that, and nobody wins except the lawyers. That's it.
Oh, yeah. They walk out with all the money.
Yeah. I mean, I realize that, sometimes that's what you have to do. And, I've been involved in billion-dollar projects that have gone completely bust in the middle of the job and the fallout from that. And how do you try to pick up the pieces? And to me, I so admire people who've got the time in, the patience in it. And, if you're really good at what you do, I find that people are actually more interested in working collaboratively. I guess, challenged by it. They're secure in their knowledge and their status and, what they want to be. So they're happy to be more engaging, so they want them to be there. They want their interest too.
Well, amazing. This has been a great conversation. We've bounced all over the place, which is great. I love doing that.
Sure.
I think we could keep talking forever. But, just to wrap things up here, I always love to ask for anybody that wants to learn more about your work, what you've done, reach out to you. I know you have a lot of projects, but you kind of have an umbrella as well. I guess what the best place to find you and reach out.
Yeah, the easiest place to find me is just go to www.𝗏𝗁𝗔𝗍𝐴IA.com. That's Kilo Delta Charlie Alpha India Alpha.com. All my contact information is there. That's my website.
Amazing. Well, Kevin, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit and have this chat. And thanks for being on.
Yeah. And my dog wants to thank everybody too.
Perfect.
He says, time to go out. Anyway.
There you
go. All right, Ian. Thanks so much. And I appreciate all your listeners listening in today. Hope they enjoyed this. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, there will be links in the show notes. And that wraps up another episode of the Conscious Design Podcast. If today's episode inspired you to bring your product idea to life and turn it into a sustainable 7-figure business, visit petermanfirm.com or click the link below. Your ideas have the power to change the world, and we're here to help make that happen. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you on the next episode.